We have a couple of questions. I've got a million questions, but we've got a couple of questions that I just want to make sure that we respond to that have come from the audience. Also, please feel free to put your stuff in the chat. So Jan, we've got a couple of questions here about the data and how it's being separated. So demographics, youth, children, etc. And I think Renee asked that question. So if you don't, we can get Renee to add more if that wasn't enough. And also we've got a question I think was from Luna. Is the data tracking app available in multiple languages, e.g. Other than English?
Yes, so yeah, and the data, of course, the idea is to do cross analysis, for example, by groups or by location, or depending on your neighborhood conditions. So and it all depends on the power of the cohort and so the number of participants. The more we want to divide things into groups, the more participants we need. So this is really one of the constraints that we have. And it also raises the issue of representativity, you know, who is participating in these types of studies. And so we are really looking to work in close relationship with local community organizations to have the best reach towards all community groups and to be the most inclusive, so that we can tell a more diverse story with our data. The app itself is currently either in French or in English. It's bilingual, and we are planning possibly to translate in other languages again to include a more diverse sample.
Okay, thank you. And then we've got a question who I believe was from Richard, and I think a few different of you folks could maybe respond to this. And and thinking about Carmel made the point around right now the only people that can participate in a lot of the things that we talked about are those that have the privilege and the access to be able to be online. How can people respond to your questions, Jan, if they can't get online? So Richard asks, what about people that have addiction issues and that are homeless? I myself am a recovering addict. So when he sees his counselor, he calls her on the phone, or he goes to see her and wears a mask. So being homeless is lonely enough, never mind not having a place to live. So I think, as we're thinking about diversity of data, as we're thinking about social cohesion and how we need to do better, does anyone on the panel maybe want to speak to how we can start ensuring that we are reaching different populations and generally more marginalized populations that are left out of a lot of these conversations? Anyone?
Maybe I could just, if it's okay if I jump in. I don't know if I can do justice to the very specific aspects of the question, but I think I was interested in social infrastructure, and I think one thing we always have to think about with things like social infrastructure is access, really, right? And there's always sort of formal and informal rules about access to these things, to these kinds of places that I think are kind of essential to building social cohesion. And so there's going to be access to the spaces that exist, but there's also going to be sort of a variable distribution of those spaces across cities and regions as well. And so I think kind of paying attention to all this stuff is really important. And I think with homelessness, for instance, like there are kind of formal rules about, being allowed, say, to have tents in certain places and all those kinds of things. So there's really kind of important issues, I think, about that we have to be really aware of. But there's also sort of the informal kind of rules about who's sort of welcome in different kinds of places. And this translates, I think, up to to community organizations and things like neighborhood houses that I study too, because I often think about these places, about the diversity of people who are welcomed in these different kinds of places, and because that has important impacts for the kinds of people we interact with, the kinds of people we have experiences with, and it can kind of change the way we maybe understand our sense of belonging based on those kinds of interactions we have too. So a little, anyway, hopefully I'm in the neighborhood of the spirit of the question.
Mm-hmm. Also jump in as someone who has, spent numerous years trying to amplify voices of marginalized people in various different communities. It's about representation, it's about getting the word out, and it's also about having genuine relationships and trust. You can't just, go in and bring attention to a very important issue if you are not a welcomed member of that community. And so a lot of work needs to go helping, especially BIPOC communities. The walking tours that go through Strathcona. I asked each of the organizations who do existing walking tours. I said, hey, what do you do when you get to Oppenheimer Park? Do you address what's going on here? And a lot of organizations didn't, because they didn't feel comfortable talking about it. They're not experts on the area. They didn't want to draw attention to it. They'll pick different routes around it. And on my walking tour, that's unacceptable. I want to make sure that if we are walking through the living rooms of people, we're going to make sure that we are going to address the reasons, the historical reasons why this park is the way it is, and why there's a housing crisis, why there's a fentanyl crisis. There's other ways that you can bring attention to it, and we all have the power to do so. It's our responsibility.
Just one other piece that I would add as well is, I think for many people who end up with homelessness and addiction issues, at the core of that journey for many people is a tremendous lack of belonging that may have in part led to some of those challenges and issues. And so, I think we also have to really challenge our own capacity and ability to think of those solutions given our own positions and privilege, and find new ways of entering into relationship. And as I think has been said, I don't think that there's an easy solution to this. I think it has to do with renegotiating our own discomfort and our own understanding of how we are and how we show up in community, who gets invited in, under what terms, and how to build our own capacity to be at ease with our own discomfort. And until we find ways of doing that, I really think that it's going to be a challenge for us to find real long-term solutions towards equity and towards understanding who we can invite into these circles. So, I think doing lip service is definitely not going to solve this problem. And I think we all have a lot of work to do. And in many ways, COVID feels like a great time for us to actually, roll up our sleeves and have some of those conversations, because at the root, this issue about social isolation and connections has a very important part that is embedded in this challenge and issue.
Thank you for that, all of you. I'm just there's a quick follow-up here, Lydia. So someone asks, I'm sorry, I don't know who it was, curious if Vancouver Foundation has research on the effects of income inequality on the roots of disconnection and resultant health and social impacts. Do you dig into economic inequality in your research?
We haven't up to now. That has not been an area that we have really looked at, although there are certainly others that have, and we reference some of that research. But as in terms of our, it's one of the things that we look at when we collect demographic data, and we look to see how that influences people's sense of belonging. But we haven't looked at that specifically as a body of research or investigation up to now.
Yan, do you look at is sort of those sort of socioeconomic variables included in your study?
Sure. I mean, what we believe is that this crisis is revealing in a certain way the extent of socioeconomic inequities, not only in terms of income and education, but also in terms of contextual living conditions that are which roles are being reinforced. And it's certainly at a time where it's an opportunity to discuss these inequities and to, in a certain way, reinvent the city also, and reinvent our neighborhoods so that they become more inclusive spaces. And this goes through transformations of our public spaces, and how our public spaces are accessible or accepting diversity and welcoming people and favoring connections. It's all a challenge, of course, in the context of physical distancing, but it's maybe even more important probably in that context to provide public spaces that allow us to be together.
Well, you're muted, Jane.
Am I muted? Oh, sorry. Yeah. I see an interesting question that came up in the chat here. It is for all panelists, and it's from Luna. And a big part of our community culture is policing, and not just by the police, but by rules, policies, practices that are segregative. Indigenous, Black, and people of color are disproportionately. How do we recreate communities that are not always surveilling each other?
Working together, collaborating together, fact checking one another on the walking tours as another example. We were talking about the origins of Chinatown, and some people were saying, well, actually it wasn't at this cross street, and it was actually here. But for some reason, the city has created an exhibit to say that the starting point was here. And so I think it's really important is to simply get to know one another. A lot of the groups that are participating on the walking tours have never worked together before with one another. And since then, so this is last May, I've been seeing different partnerships happening throughout the year. And for me, this gives me a lot of joy. We call that nachas in Hebrew, so that you can, you know, see the fruits of your labor. All I wanted were for these people to get a chance to get to know one another. That's all it takes. Get to know your neighbor.
Sean?
Maybe if you don't mind me just seconding what Carmel's saying and saying that I find it to be really important. And when I'm thinking in my own work, when I'm thinking about social infrastructure, I'm thinking of this idea of, I'm calling it cosmopolitan social infrastructure, but just the idea of places that bring diversity together and are open to bringing diverse people together. And I don't want to be too Pollyannish about it, but I do think that there is something to those kinds of having those experiences of interacting, getting to know people, spending time working on projects together that actually leads to a greater understanding of ourselves, of the people we're interacting with, but also an openness beyond that. And this is a bit, you know, like I said, it's a bit aspirational a bit for me too, but you can actually see this kind of stuff happen in research as well, though.
Does Jan or Lydia, do you want to respond? We are in our last minute here. I can't believe how quickly these sessions go. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, the history of city is in part based on segregation practices, you know, and it's time to change these practices and think again. So that's for sure. It's not a new story, but it's a story we should rewrite for the future, if I can say.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that as well is, in many ways, I think if not now, when?
What's the second part of that? If not,
If
you,
not now,
who?
when? Yeah, and who? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.